record now. Yeah, let's get started.
Yeah.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Kijin Song, and I'm a postdoc researcher in the Urban Information Lab in the School of Architecture at UT Austin. Welcome to our lightning talk series on smart city research. This talk series is funded through the UT's Good System project. So we invite speakers from academia, industry, and the communities to share the research events and the needs related to the smart cities. So if you are interested in this topic, please feel free to visit our website for our past talk and other activities at smartcity.tech.utexas.edu. For today, we are very excited to have Dr. Katie Parnell as our guest speaker. Dr. Parnell is a chartered human factors practitioner and a senior research fellow in human factors engineering from the Transportation Research Group at the University of Southampton in the United Kingdom. Katie has recently received the anniversary fellowship to study gender equity in future transportation systems and has a particular interest in sociotechnical systems as well as the user-centered design. She has a background in road safety research, completing her doctorate and authoring a book on the application of the sociotechnical system analysis to driver distraction. She has also conducted postdoctoral research projects in the aviation domain on the innovative UK-funded Open Flight Deck project, as well as working on the Trustworthy Autonomous System project to understand human-robot interactions with road transportation and unmanned aerial vehicle application. Katie has published numerous articles in the field of human-computer interactions, safety science, accident prevention, and ergonomics. In 2021, she also awarded the Seoul Aviation Award by the Honorable Air Pilots Association for her contribution to aviation safety research. For her talk today is titled Gender-equitable e-Micromobility. So without further ado, I'll pass the mic to Dr. Parnell.
Great, thank you for that introduction, Kijin, and yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. Yeah, it's really great to sort of speak to different people and meet you all. So yeah, I'm going to talk today about gender-equitable electric mobility. I've got a slide to start off, which is about me, but Kijin's just nicely kind of covered all of that. But yeah, I've been at the University of Southampton since 2013. I did my PhD there, looking at driver distraction, mainly looking at interactions with distractions from inside the vehicle and the sorts of technologies manufacturers are putting inside the vehicle and whether they should be legal or not. And yeah, looking at user-centered design in cockpits, so working with pilots to develop applications in cockpits to embed them in the design process and get them on board with the different technologies to make sure they're actually usable for the tasks that they need. And I've been working on the Trustworthy Autonomous Systems project for the last couple of years, which is where I met Kijin through one of the SAM pits that we did just before Christmas, looking at resilience autonomous transport. So looking at interactions between autonomous vehicles and cyclists, as well as the trust in swarming drones, so something a bit outside of transport. And I've got a proposal underway looking at dressing and surgical robots. So within human factors, we get to look at lots of different aspects and listen to different domains, which is great. And I took a year out and worked in industry for Dyson when they tried to do their electric vehicle before that project was canned. So I've got some industry experience as well, which is always interesting. And yeah, I've just started a fellowship looking at gender equitable future transport networks, which is kind of where the talk today is going to sort of fall within. So just to start off, I don't know what your backgrounds are, but just to give you a background on human factors as I see it, and also sociotechnical systems. So human factors is defined by the International Ergonomics Association. So we sort of see ergonomics and human factors are combined together. But it's a scientific discipline concerned with the understanding of interactions between humans and other elements of a system. So those other elements could be technologies, but they could also be other people. So we're really interested in how people are interacting within their system, as well as with the sort of wider context as well. We apply a whole host of different methods and analysis, quantitative, qualitative, and the main aim is to optimize human well-being and overall system performance. So that's kind of what we're about. It kind of covers three key areas which overlapped in human factors. So we cover cognitive factors. So quite a lot of us have backgrounds in psychology, and we use a lot of psychological theory. But we also look at physical factors such as physical anatomy, but also the physical factors in the environment. And then organizational factors as well. So looking at structures of society. And this is sort of where the sociotechnical system kind of aspect of it and element comes in. And this diagram on the lower right-hand side isn't brilliant, but it kind of captures what the key elements of a sociotechnical system. So we have the social system, which is the structures we have in society and our organizations. And then we have the people within it as well, and how those two interacting is kind of the social side of a system. And then we have the technical system, which is the more sort of physical hardware and software, and also facilities in a system, and then the tasks, so the work that these different physical systems are actually used to perform. And then sociotechnical system kind of looks at that in a complex theory approach to see how all these different elements are interacting, and there's a whole host of different methods that we apply to look at that. But that's just a bit of background. So what I want to talk today is a project that I recently completed, which is called GEM Guidelines, which is Gender-equitable e-Micromobility Guidelines. And this was part of a wider project called Decarbonising Transport Through Electrification. And it looks at a whole sort of different ways in which we can decarbonise from vehicles, associated vehicle technologies, charging infrastructure, electricity as a transport fuel, and also smart mobility, which is where this fell within. And it was a very small project. It was only about £10,000, and it was looking specifically, the core was looking for equality, diversity and inclusivity issues, which is why we proposed this study looking at gender equitability. And it's something in the UK that's on the rise quite a lot, is sort of more funding towards looking at EDI issues, which is really important. So just a bit of an overview of the research. So the aim of the project, and it was only a 3-month project, I should say. So it's it wasn't a particularly long project, but we have got some interesting sort of findings. So the aim was to review the gendered use of e-Micromobility and advise on ways in which we can make sure it's more inclusive. And we sort of did 2-pronged attack. So we did a bottom-up approach. We conducted interviews and focus groups with users and non-users. And this is really to understand that user-centered perspectives. And then we also did a top-down. So this is where we applied the sociotechnical systems methods to sort of understand the wider sociotechnical systems view, sort of the values and responsibilities, and also the key actors across a society that really have the responsibility to make these sorts of technologies and transport modes inclusive to all. And the main aim was to come up with some guidelines that account for gender in how we use e-Micromobility. And in the UK, particularly in Southampton, we had, when we talk about e-scooters, they've got these shared platforms. So they're not personally owned. It's only legal to use the shared platform e-scooters. And then e-bikes, we've only recently had a shared e-bike platform put in, and that was before this research. So we're talking more about privately owned e-bikes and also e-cargo bikes, which were used by a few participants as well. So just a little bit of background about where the research idea came from. So in our transport research group at Southampton, quite a few of us read this book called Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez. And in this book, she highlights that there's a gender data gap, which essentially suggests that there's not as much data on how females interact with the world, or how females the sort of metrics that females have in comparison to men. So therefore, there's sort of a male bias on how systems are designed and how technologies are designed, because we don't really understand how females are using them. And so this can come from things such as unrepresentative samples, so not having an equal sample compared to a target population, maybe having more males involved, particularly when you do convenience sampling in terms of an engineering department. We find in our own research that we kind of tend to have quite a more male heavy presence in our sampling. And aggregating data, so averaging out data between males and females without really drilling down into potential differences. Inaccurate reporting, so maybe reporting data from unbiased samples as being representative biased samples as being representative as a whole population, when actually maybe the data hasn't been analysed in that way, as well as unintentional biases that we may all bring in terms of research questions, but also the sorts of research that gets funded as well, which may have some of its biases as well. So we've got a group in our research, a group, sort of a working group that's looking to help close this gender data gap and seeing where we can help to close it. And I think it's particularly pertinent because a lot of examples do relate to transport. So in the UK, gender impacts on employment in transport sector. So we only have 22% of workers, sorry, this is more broadly in the EU, but 22% of workers are women. And when they are employed, it's traditionally in positions of lower responsibility. So they're less involved in the decision making. We've also got the issue of safety in relation to crash test dummies. That was in the press more recently in the UK. The crash test dummies are based on male bodies and they just make them smaller to represent females, but it doesn't account for the different body distributions in terms of muscle or bone density. So females are more likely to be injured when they're in a crash compared to males. And it also impacts on our travel patterns. So we know that kind of stereotypically, but females tend to do more trip chaining, so going from one destination to the next, whereas men make more unilateral journeys. And the types of things that they need to bring on these journeys differ, and the types of transportation modes that they sort of prefer on these different modes is also different, which is why we wanted to think about it in terms of e-micromobility and how that might influence the travel patterns and what role gender plays in that. So we did a bit of background research on what's been done already, and there was more research on e-bikes than e-scooters just because they've been around for a bit longer. We found the research and the literature found countries where cycling's a more popular mode of transport, less popular mode of transport, such as the UK or the USA, females tend to use e-bikes less than males. But in countries where there's higher levels of cycling, so the Netherlands and areas in mainland Europe where cycling is a lot more popular, the uptake of e-bikes is the same for males and females. There's some cultural influences there. Also, males and females have different incentives for using e-bikes, with females valuing ability to travel with children. And the use of e-cargo bikes is quite big. And also females tend to be more safety conscious, so prevents them from feeling comfortable when using micromobility. So this is a trend from traditional cycling as well, that they feel less safe on the roads. They've got a higher risk perception, which puts them off cycling. And in terms of e-scooters, there's less research, but it suggests that the early adopters of e-scooters are traditionally young white males, and this is aligned with other new technologies and new transport modes that come in, typically taken up by young white males first. So it's just quite interesting to see what might be driving some of these things. So that's why we did our research. So started off with the user focus groups and interviews. So we did a mixture of both. We had a total of 24 participants, 12 female, 12 male, to sort of get that balance. And we matched them on age characteristics, and we did them both online and in person. So we had one online focus group and one online in-person focus group, and then all of the interviews were done online. And that was mainly to be as inclusive as possible. We really wanted to make sure that we could get this matched sample and try and being as convenient to the participants as possible to get that. We had a mix of users and non-users because we wanted to get those different perspectives, and we tried to include those in the focus groups as well to have people from different perspectives. And the main questions we asked targeted around what was motivating people who did use e-micromobility to use it, and what were the barriers for the people who didn't, or what were the barriers that were perceived, and maybe how they could be broken down. And we looked at a different set of scenarios to sort of tease out some of these things. And then for an analysis, we did a deductive thematic coding using some predetermined gender factors. So these factors are something that came out from a previous literature review that we did as part of our working group. So this is a published paper in ergonomics, and we found some key gender factors that related to a whole host of different transport modes. So we sought the literature across transport from cycling, but also walking and driving and rail, buses, even maritime and aviation. And we sought to identify what are the key gender factors across all these different types of transport modes that are impacting how males and females might use them differently. And we got these 6 key factors. So family, community roles, so the traditional roles that gender might have in terms of families, perceived safety, how that might vary by gender, ergonometric standards, so this is the actual physical body types and body variances between males and females, mobility needs, which covers trip chaining and the different types of journeys that might be happening, urban structure, so this is the actual infrastructure in place, and then user behavior as well. And then within these 6 factors, we had some sub-factors. So we've got this sort of thematic framework. So we've broken them down to get this framework of potential factors where gender can influence travel choices. So we applied these factors to our data from the focus groups and interviews, doing sort of qualitative research. And essentially what we've got here is it's a frequency count essentially, but what it highlights is how many times people are mentioning each of these factors in relation to them being incentives for using e-micromobility or barriers to e-micromobility. And we've disaggregated by gender. So we've got males in the purple colour and females in the pink. And broadly speaking, there was a lot of similarities in what people were saying. There wasn't wild differences across genders, but there were some interesting differences once we dug down into the actual qualitative data. So, for instance, it was quite clear that no males mentioned any of the family and community role factors. So they didn't mention dependence or division of work when they were talking, but females did. And they mentioned them in terms of them being incentives. So using an e-bike to get an accompanied child to school, or using an e-cargo bike was quite a useful thing. But then in contrast to this, when they're using e-scooters, a lack of a tandem option when traveling with younger children is obviously quite a significant barrier. It's quite hard to travel by scooter when you've got a very young child. So that's quite a big barrier. In terms of mobility needs and trip characteristics, so it's relating to the types of trips that people are doing, men and females both talked about these as incentives, as barriers, but it was quite interesting that the men tended to talk about it as a lot more practicalities involved. So when in terms of incentives, they were more likely to talk about the actual journey, the sort of trip itself, and whether the e-bike or e-scooter was a good fit for it. So if it's good at bridging that gap between a journey that's too long to walk or too short to drive, that's an incentive. So they're talking about it a lot more practical terms. And then similarly in terms of a barrier, they're talking about batteries and if they were long enough to go the distance. So talking about the distance of the trip quite a lot of the time. And females talked about this as well, but to a lesser degree. Perceived safety was quite a big one. So this is both males and females highlighted that there was quite a lot of safety concerns when going on the roads with these types of transportation modes, just feeling quite vulnerable to cars. But what was interesting was that we have another sub-factor, which is fear, which is the more visceral response to safety. And it was only females that were mentioning this code, and this is when they're sort of talking about a lack of confidence or feeling anxious, having a nerve-wracking experience. So it's much more of a sort of visceral experience that they're reporting in contrast to males. And this is backed up by the literature that suggests that women have sort of a higher risk perception and feel less confident when cycling on the roads. And then related to this, infrastructure. So this is again something that's talked about by both males and females, and is a really big issue, particularly in the UK, on our quite historic roads that don't really account for these new modes of transportation. And some people said it's an incentive, but more longer down the line. So obviously in the future, with more people using these modes of transport, traffic's going to be reduced and there's better flow around cities. But at the moment, it's quite a significant barrier, both males and females feeling like there's kind of confusion on where e-scooters in particular should be, with people using them on the pavement, which they're not allowed to do in the UK, and how people are positioning themselves at traffic lights, and people just ignoring the rules of the road, which they do quite a lot of the time. So that's just sort of a brief overview of some interesting findings from our focus groups and interviews. The next stage of the analysis is this sociotechnical systems. And we did do a cognitive work analysis, but I'm not going to go into that in this presentation. It's sort of still underway. But what we did do is an actor map, which maps out all responsible actors in the sociotechnical system. So if you're not aware, so an actor map maps out everything from international committees at the top, and then we've got national committees, and this is all quite UK centric, but then we've got the government at the next level, then the regulatory bodies, industries and more local governments. Then we have the resource providers, which is everyone that was providing resources. So from the e-scooter manufacturers all the way to the battery developers and the traffic planners. Then we have the end users themselves, and then we have the equipment and the environment as well. So it's a way of sort of taking out and looking at who's involved in making these e-scooters arrive onto our roads and actually being used for them. So we mapped them out for e-scooters, e-bikes, and then both in green, where they both kind of focus on the same thing. So obviously higher up in the actor map, they're accounting for more of the similar kind of things. And this was really useful because what we were aiming to do was provide some recommendations. So when we were providing recommendations, we want to know who we're targeting, what actors we're going to target. So the recommendations that we made cover 4 key areas. So training, equipment, legislation and procedure, and these are kind of quite typical human factors areas that we aim to target. And we wanted to provide these recommendations, again, looking at the data that we've got from these different gender factors so that we can make sure that we're making them gender equitable from our research and the approach that we've taken. And we had a total of 26 recommendations across these areas. So on the left is sort of a breakdown by the different categories. So we had the most number for equipment, and similarly, and then training, and then legislation and procedure had the same. And then in relation to gender factors, so there was less for ergonomic standards, but this might have been because we weren't actually looking at the size. We didn't have the e-scooter or e-bike to hand, so we weren't really focusing on that. We were talking more about the actual access and use. And there's generally a similar number across the different gender factors. But I'll just talk through very kind of briefly what these kind of recommendations entailed. So the ones related to legislation were sort of targeting policy changes, and these can relate to sort of in terms of family, ensuring that policy targets people travelling with dependents and representing these in policy. The safety equipment, so how can we make sure that people are using more safety equipment, ensuring that there's more training. So in the UK, you just have to have a provisional driving licence to be able to access the e-scooter. For e-bikes, there's nothing, but maybe there should be a legal requirement for people doing a little bit more training before they're let loose on the roads. Legislation on policy surrounding the design of roadways and making sure e-micromobility is thought about in the design of roadways, and also enforcing the laws. There's not really much enforcement going on in the UK at the moment about how people are using these e-bikes, and they're kind of getting a little bit lawless. You see sort of 2-3 people on them at once going along the pavements. So the next is equipment. So here we're talking about the actual equipment, so e-bikes and e-scooters, and the design of them. So being able to target the use of families in the design stages is a really useful thing to think about, and hasn't really been thought about before, I don't think. The design of the e-scooters and the lights, they're not actually that bright on the e-scooters at the moment. Considerations for the different types of journeys that e-micromobilities are used for. Ergonomics, this is making sure that gender disaggregated data is used to inform the design. And we have things such as the equipment relating to encumbered travel, so making sure people can bring things with them. If they're traveling with a shoulder bag, for instance, it's hard to use a scooter. The facilities at storage locations or places of work where people might need to be travelling with these modes of transportation. And also we had one of the big barriers was a phone interface, and people not being able to actually access the phone, or being too scared to try to access things such as the shared mobility platform with the phone. And then the infrastructure as well. And then procedures. So some people suggested that they might like to have a try before you buy, particularly if they're using them with children, and using cargo bikes. So maybe some hire schemes might be quite useful to encourage people to use them. Looking at the placement of the hubs where these e-scooters are, and the processes in place surrounding gender disaggregated data again. So what are the procedures for ensuring this is done? Looking at how we can make sure e-micromobility is integrated with other transport modes. And then another thing that was quite interesting was that a lot of people, and particularly females, highlighted that actually they were quite surprised at how it improved their mental health when they were using these kinds of transport modes in comparison to cars. So being outside, getting outside a lot more. So maybe this could be something that could be publicised a little bit more when marketing these kinds of transport mode to encourage people to use them. And then lastly, training. So training covers a whole range of these. So training for people to travel with children, and also other road users, and how to act with people traveling with children is also quite useful. More broader training, as I've spoken about before, training related to how to access the e-scooters, what happens when the battery runs out, and also how to safely interact with other road users at different intersections. So there's a whole host of recommendations here. Some of them overlap, but they're broadly targeting quite a different range of things. So what we wanted to do was then sort of see how each of these actors, and all these actors across these different levels of our system, can be targeted with these recommendations. So we went back to the actor map with our recommendations and tried to see who could do what. And we did find a few more actors when we did this. So in pink, we found more such as public transport providers, the dependents, maybe road safety trainers, training resources, and this is ongoing work. I think there probably will be more once we've kind of iterated this a little bit more, but it's just good to sort of keep this updated. And then what we were then able to do, so this slide here, maybe a little bit of a mess, but we wanted to aggregate and see what actors need to do what. So this is for each of the different recommendation types, how many actors need to be making these actions. So you can see that there's quite a lot of actions need to be taken by people who are the resource providers. There was more resource providers that...
Here's what I found.
Oh, sorry, that's my watch. Resource providers, there was more actors within this category, which is why there might be more actions that need to be taken. But actually, it also suggests that these people have quite a lot of power in order to make the changes that are needed. And then also the equipment and the environment is another area. The equipment itself, but also the road infrastructure. So quite a lot of the recommendations targeted road infrastructure, and that's quite a key thing that came out from the focus groups as well. So this is kind of ongoing data analysis, which is why it's maybe a little bit of a mess at the moment. But what we need to understand is how this feeds down the system. So right from international committees, how these can feed down to ensure that resource providers are providing the right kinds of equipment and environment for people to be able to take up this transport mode more accessibly. So just a light summary. So this work's provided an insight into how gender factors that we found from those more traditional modes in our previous literature review relate to the new modes of e-micromobility. We've used an equal gender sample size and disaggregated by gender to look at the similarities and differences in perspective. So this has enabled us to make gender-equitable recommendations. And also it's important to note that when we consider gender, we do make it more accessible for everyone. We're not just focusing on females or males. We're making sure that both genders are satisfied and it's more inclusive for everybody, which is important when we're talking about these more futuristic sustainable modes of transport. And then just in the future work that I'm working on at the moment is to develop an online survey to understand a bit more the public's views on some of these recommendations, such as legislation changes or how much people know about legislation. It was quite clear not many people knew much about it at the time in the focus groups, as well as the requirements for training and how they might perceive safety. So that's just some future work, but that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. It was a really fascinating talk. Yeah, I'll just wait for the audience to see if there is any questions from the audience. So I think Arya has a one question. Arya, yeah.
Thank you, Katie,
questions.
for this talk. So have any of these recommendations are implemented and they did have any impact on reducing the gender disparities that you saw earlier?
No, so these are they haven't been. These are ones that we've proposed, and we've just written a proposal to the UK government to suggest that they should be used, but we haven't enacted them. And it's sort of what we're doing at the moment is to try and it's not an easy quick fix. There's a lot of them take kind of need stuff from the top. So it's in process. But nice to see you again, Arya.
All right. And Zhao also has a question.
Hey, Katie, very nice meeting you. I have a quick question on your research finding. As you know, both US, UK, Australia don't have very good bike infrastructure or culture. So compared to Northern European country or even Netherlands or Germany. So how much do you think that's an infrastructure hardware problem, culture or gender disparity problem?
Yeah, so I said at the beginning, some of the literature we read was that in countries where there's less funding and infrastructure in place for things such as cycling, the gender differences are a lot bigger, and that is because of this safety perspective. I think that females don't have as much perception of safety on the roads; they feel a lot more vulnerable. So yeah, I definitely think that plays quite a big part. I don't know if I've answered your question there, but I agree.
Yeah, I feel like even not just a female or male also feel very vulnerable ride a bicycle. In Austin, 2 of my students get into car accident by ride a scooter. And I think that to me it's more like an infrastructure problem than a culture or gender problem. I ride a bicycle perfectly in Netherlands when I was studying there. It's just everybody ride bicycle with a designated bicycle lane and a signal system. I think anyway, that's just my comment.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, it's definitely everyone, but I think that's why we're taking this gendered lens to see what the actual differences are. And I think by understanding that maybe if females do have a little bit more of a high risk perception and feel a bit safe, we can improve it for everybody to make sure that it is better.
Thank you for the answer.
Katie, I have some specific questions for your recommendation. So you got some more higher numbers of the recommendations for equipment and training, so especially for the research providers and equipment and environment. So could you a little bit more explain how to get those results, and how do you get these numbers on here?
Yeah, so these numbers are taken from, across the 26 different recommendations, for every recommendation we said what actors are involved, and there's quite a lot of actors that are involved in every recommendation, and so right the way from the top, so there's a few that would require maybe at the top only like the Society for Automotive Engineers, but then when you get down to things such as legislation, obviously the police are going to be involved, but then you need also the Highways England to enforce those kind of legislations, and then you need further down the line sort of councils to be able to apply. So for each recommendation there's quite a number of different actors, and we're just calculating the number of actions. So the resource providers, because there's quite a lot of resource providers in here, there's obviously a lot more actions that are going to be taken. But these are just a frequency count of the number of actors across each different one. So yeah, it's something that I'll be honest, it's kind of new data, so we're just trying to go into it a bit more. But just as an initial picture, it suggests that there's a lot that can be done in sort of the design of these systems and the road infrastructure as well.
Thank you. Interesting. Is there any questions? All right, so I think we are ready at the time to wrap up now. So I want to stop here. If you have more questions, please feel free to reach out to Dr. Parnell. Katie, if you can you share your email address on the chat?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I can type that in now.
And if you miss her email address, then yeah, you can feel free to send us an email. We are happy to connect you with Katie as well. All right, so thank you so much, Katie, for your wonderful talk today. And we'll post the video file on our website soon.
Okay.
And also, if you are interested in our future talk, you are also welcome to visit our website at smartcity.tech.utexas.edu to see our past recordings and any information for future talk. Actually, our next presentation will be held on February 21st with Emily Gates from Transit app. She's going to talk about the public transportation trip planning app through the Transit. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for joining the talk. And yeah, I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.